talking about the problem, I'm interested in providing that first principles perspective. And that's really helpful for where you're at, because at this time in the course, it's about knowing what the problem is, doing the research, understanding what the organization is seeking to achieve and how it might not be getting there, and how you can look at improving the customer experience and what changes you might need to make from the perspective of the organization and its culture, and what is the experience that you'd be seeking and what's not being met. So it's really about identifying the problem. What is that problem space? And so I want to go back to what a problem is. So we know intuitively what a problem is, but what does that mean when we unpack it? And how can that help you with those activities when you're gathering information, you're trying to figure out what is the problem, what is the research I need to do, how am I going to measure success or unsuccess? Okay, so I talked about this design process. You may have seen it in many different ways. This is one that I like because it shows growth in the spiral formation. So the more that you go through this process, the more value you're bringing or growing into the customer ecosystem, for example. So when we're talking about evaluating, it's like what aligns to the purpose. This is your synthesizing activities, prioritizing, where you're providing direction and meaning. And this is also about, from a business perspective, when you're bringing purpose into what you're doing and bringing values and providing that sort of culture. Exploring is about the research, weighing up if you're meeting those values in the kind of immersive space. So are they actually being met? We immerse ourselves, we gather the information, research, test and learn. And we're exploring that ecosystem and being a part of it by putting ourselves there, essentially. Things like going and talking to customers rather than just sitting on our desk and coming up with ideas. What's the problem like for customers at the moment? And if we're making or proposing any changes, doing some kind of research to learn about how this impacts our customers. Talking about the ecosystem, addressing the notion that the experience that a customer has isn't just siloed, isn't confined to a particular company or product or service. Experience is a part of a wider ecosystem of many products and services in general. So the generating part, that's when we're coming up with something new. That's the innovation. We're coming up with ideas. It's this diversive type of thinking, new models, adaptations, new changes, innovating new experiences. It's about generating those new ways of doing things and potentially new experiences. The whole thing is a design process, but this is that traditional design work of making things, executing things. So as you can see with this model, it's almost like a three-legged stool kind of concept. If you're missing one aspect of it, standing on two legs, you're probably going to fall down. It's hard to balance. For example, if you're just doing all the exploration, could be something like a university, just doing all the research. It's not necessarily generating new ideas, just doing the research. It's only one part of it. You can get really theoretical, but actually not proposing something new. If you're just doing design and generating things, but you're not kind of evaluating it, you just be just making all different things. And there's no way you're doing that sort of conversive type of activity where you're weighing things up and you're taking things away. And making sure that you're getting the value you want. If you're just spending all your time evaluating, you're coming up with different ways of measuring things, different strategies, for example. It's a bit of a balancing act, and it's a useful tool. It's also interesting to look at it from this perspective where that sort of evaluation from the organization is a top-down. When you're exploring with your customers, when you're generating, it's more bottom-up. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic there. Enough of that. I'll talk more about that, especially when we go to design theories in a bit more depth. But I want to talk about the problem. And before talking about the problem and unpacking it, I want to say, what happens if we don't really understand the problem? What happens if we just keep going about the way that we do things? There's some design flaw in the Titanic. It wasn't necessarily looking at all the sort of context that it might come across, such as a massive iceberg. There's this concept of big banks, too big to fail. We had these big institutions that came across a change. Governments had to step in, 2008. And we're seeing this idea, right? There's this idea that having these big organizations, they're going to be resilient, but they're not necessarily. You may have remembered some of these. They may have been, at the time, A lot of people may have thought Nokia, big chunky brick phones, BlackBerry, it was amazing for business. They're never going to go out of business. Kodak, printing photos, Blockbuster. Why would you have to worry about making online film? Lots of examples of where you can see quite established organizations going down a certain path, not being able to adapt easily. Seeing major companies always going extinct. Some of the ideas and slides from another course that I'm actually doing called Regenerative Leadership, when there's things from that which I'd like to introduce to you. I'll put their copyright. So the world is increasingly changing and it's complex. It's rapidly adapting. In the 70s, you could see that there was like basic technology. There was mainframes, there was big computers. Technology is a big driver, of course, of change. We saw in the 1980s, it was like office computing. You had those mini computers. I don't know if you remember. There was Microsoft starting out. There was there was Mac and PCs, of course. 1990s, you saw there was improvement of that. Email, you got mail, film, for example. 2000s, you can see that the internet started. There was the browser wars. There was Internet Explorer. There was Netscape, mobile smartphones in the 2010s. Wearables started coming up. This idea of big data. We're getting all this data, cloud computing. 2020 now, things are changing. There's more sort of Internet of Things, digital money, blockchain, the start of quantum computing, adaptations with genes and this merging of technology and biology. Things are changing all the time, and we really need to understand how things are going. We need to look at a new process to ensure that we're adapting. And of course, the design-centric companies are the ones that are going well. So this is a report looking at what are the top sort of more design-centric companies and how are they going in comparison to the other sort of Fortune 500 companies. And you can see that design-centered ones were the ones that were coming up on top up to 2015. That trend is probably way ahead as well. So there's a problem with the old way of doing things. So there was an interesting report that came out just recently from Gupta, who's a biologist in Cambridge, basically saying, look, our economy is not just a people economy. It's not just companies and individuals. We're part of an ecosystem. And the way that we're going, not only leading to companies failing, but it's having obviously an impact in the ecosystems that sustain us. We're embedded in nature. We're not external to it. When we're looking at sort of the customer experience, we're not just looking at the individual with the organization. We're looking at multiple organizations, multiple services in an ecosystem that obviously includes nature. We're not external to it. The idea that we're siloed from it is kind of a big failure of the way that we think. So yeah, it's a time to change how we think and how we measure success in many different avenues. So one of the things that came out of that report was this idea of the economy of things, of people, of interactions existing within the biosphere, and they're very much connected. So the economy is embedded within rather than external to it. And so that's a really neat diagram that describes that. So there's obviously a problem there. So let's talk about problems. And why I wanted to give you that little bit of an introduction is because it's helpful to be able to just get back to that first principle. What is the problem and how do we unpack it? So in really simple terms, the foundation of why we act, what's behind our behavior is very simple and very pragmatic. So we essentially were always looking at going from a lower value to a higher value state. And that's when we know when a need is met. A really simple explanation is to say the state of being dehydrated. I've got my bottle of water. I'm hydrated. Opposite, if there's an action taken with certain tools or objects in our context or environment, such as I'm drinking too much coffee to hydrate myself, I'm going to go backwards, and that's an unmet need. So it's a very simple way of looking at it. So you've got the low value, you've got the high value that can tell you if a need is met. Another simple way of looking at the problem space, the current state, often when we want to improve things, the future state is opportunities. They follow this similar pattern, right? It starts with those intentions. What are our intentions? What do we want? What are our beliefs, values, desires, emotions? From there, that drives our actions and interactions, that often with tools, with objects, with people, products, in the context, in a place, in a moment of time and an area. After that, there's a result, outcome, consequence, and impact. So similar to what I showed you before, if the results meet the intentions, then we have essentially a good experience. If they don't, if the actions that we're taking are getting a very different result than our intentions, beliefs, our values, then our experience is impacted. It's not a good experience, essentially. So when we're breaking down the problem, this is a really helpful tool to see, okay, what is the problem, right? In a nutshell, the problem is our intention not met by the results of whatever we're doing, of the actions that we're taking with the products or with the interactions we're having with an organization. We can talk about intentions, beliefs, values, desires. It's like our consciousness, the thing that's driving us or motivating us to do something. Where we're actually doing that is in a medium. It's not happening in our heads. It's happening in the medium of our reality. Our interactions in real life will either resist or allow that kind of change. So we're looking for some kind of change. We're wanting to improve. We're wanting to get to a high value state. What we're using, where we're doing it, who we're interacting with, the products, the places we're in, they're either going to resist or allow that change to happen. And that's going to give us the experience. So what experience we get as a result, the outcomes, the consequences, the wider impact, that tells us, how well we met what we initially intended. And interestingly, you can flip that around. It gives you the same formula as Einstein's famous formula. So instead of energy, E, it's essentially it is, right? Energy, a good experience is the energy in that ecosystem with people, places, other organizations. So it's, in a sense, it is the energy. It equals the mass. So mass, in a sense, is like a big force. You think about like a big planet that's difficult to move. So if we're trying to move that, it's a big resistance. So it's a similar kind of concept, speed of light. Maybe like consciousness, right? So it's the thing that's driving, it motivating us to take that action. So what's interesting about that is that it can help you frame the types of ways that you're going to research the problem. So it's going to be key to understand, firstly, what's important to people. What do they value? What are the beliefs that they hold true? What are their desires? And then also, in the way that they're currently acting or interacting, how satisfied are they in that particular context of getting their needs met? Are they getting their needs met? How well are they getting their needs met? And that can give you an idea of whether the experience is good or bad. Because what you want to be doing is you want to be understanding, of course, from the individual perspective, but from people that may be your customers at the moment or your potential customers as well. But also the impact it has on the wider sort of ecosystem, people, places, contexts, etc., because that also tells us about the overall experience.